And what's going on, everyone? Thanks for tuning back into the channel. I've got my friend Travis Drum here again with me today. Travis, how are you, buddy?
Doing great, Zach. It is 6 o'clock in the morning for anybody wondering when this is being filmed. So I got Zach out of bed early for one.
Well, you know, just in order to give the people what they want, I've had 50 recommendations. Have Travis back on the channel. Have Travis back on the channel. Leave a comment down below if you think Travis should be on the channel more. And also leave a comment down below if you think Travis should let me pay him to post all of his Olivet Discourse series to my channel. It's out there, and a lot of you haven't heard it, and it's really good. But I'm trying to con him into letting me post it, so we'll see. Leave a dollar amount down below too, but don't get too crazy. What would be a fair price for me to pay him for it? So
You're always talking about buying me Chinese food. I don't know.
I bought you Chinese food yesterday.
Yeah, you did. That was nice too. Thank you.
You're welcome. We ate at a Chinese restaurant called Tokyo House, so figure that one out.
It is the Chinese restaurant, by the way.
Only in Jonesboro, Arkansas, can you get
Here
such
in
an
our
Olivet
neck of the
dish.
woods, anyway.
All right, Trav, we're going back to the Olivet Discourse. This is a big one. I think this is one of the most important ones because a lot of people split it at 36. And today, we want to show why we don't think it can be split at 36. And we'll begin by reading the passage. It says, "But of that day," and there's an emphasis obviously here on that day, "no one an hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." So we've had events that have been kind of leading us up to where we're at now. And let's take a mindset that a lot of folks take. Travis, do you think splitting it at 36 is the most common?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, well, either that or the Great Tribulation. Those seem to be the dominant two. But yeah, I would say, especially in the post millennial world, I think this one probably is split more so than anything else. And I think it's because, you have to do something with it, and you're told, well, you can't believe what we believe. So, like, what do you do? And so, well, there's that word that day. So we got to split it here and make that those far future events, with that telescoping view that we've talked about.
Okay. We spent 46 minutes in the very first video talking about Matthew 24:3 and how they split these two questions. Well, now we're to the point where they actually split it. So just to kind of rehash it out, people such as Ken Gentry, who we're going to use a lot in this video, just because he's one of the main proponents of this view, they're going to say that in Matthew 24:3, there are multiple questions asked. There are the questions asked about 80-70, which all the way up verses 4 to 35 talk about 80-70. And then in Matthew 24:3, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, which coming there is Parousia. Ken Gentry will say is a time in our distant future, not the 80-70 coming, but a future advent. So verse 36 is the split, which begins the answer about a coming of Christ in our future. And let's read an article, part of an article that Gentry wrote May 1st, 2014 on postmillennial worldview. Travis, you want to read that?
Yeah, it says, in this passage, this generation is set in contrast to that day. With these words, the Lord looks beyond the signs just given for this generation. I don't know how to say that Greek word, but the near demonstrative in verse 24:34 to the events of that day, switching to the far demonstrative in verse 36, and thus the Lord's attention turns to his distant second advent at the end of history.
Okay, so hopefully that concept's laid out for everybody. At least you can see what's going on here. Now, one press back I know that me and Travis would have that we pushed back on the first video in Matthew 24:3 is the concept of the end of history. We don't think the Bible talks about the end of history. We think it talks about the time of the end. So the end of the old covenant age, that can be found in numerous texts. So when we read that in the passage, we're saying that's the end of the old covenant age. I think we quoted from the Psalms and probably quoted Daniel 7:18, Ephesians 3:21, talking about how it goes
Yep.
on forever and ever, maybe Isaiah 9. So this thought of switching to us, and on the surface appears to me to be an okay argument. I mean, the first time I heard it, I thought, okay, well,
Yeah.
Possibly, very possibly so. If there's two questions that are asked there, one thing you've got to establish though is that in Matthew 24:3 that he's asking about the end of the age. Now we're not going to revisit that in this video. Again, go back and watch the first one because we talked about Paul talking about how they were at the end of the age and how we believe the end of the age is the end of the old covenant age, considering all the verses that talk about how the new covenant age never ends. So in Gentry's paradigm here, he's got a parousia at the end of world history, 2 Peter 3, when the planet's blown up. Now, I will say this for Ken Gentry, at least he's consistent. He knows if he gives up the end of the age, it's over. You think he knows that, Travis?
I do think he knows that. I think a lot of people do, and that's why they try to do something with this. And that's why they'll go to the questions and try to split them and make them about, near future versus far future events instead of just understanding that they're asking about the same thing. This is the parousia and the end of the age are concurrent events, and this one right here, and I know that we're going to get into it a lot more, but this is really not that hard to clear up and understand what's being communicated here. It's hard whenever you bring an assumption to the table that it can't mean what it means, right? That's when it gets hard when he can't just be talking about the same things, everything that's happening with his parousia and end of the age. So if he can't be talking about that, what do we do with it then? How do we understand it? And that's where you get to slicing and dicing and saying, well, maybe he's asking near future and far future, and here's the split where, and you make a jumbled up mess out of something that's really pretty cut and dry. And Zach, to me, the easiest way to kind of, I guess, fix that discrepancy, that a lot of people have with this is to understand how this is written out in the Greek. And what I mean by that is in your Bible, if you're looking at Matthew 24, right above verse 36, there's a heading that says, no one knows that day and hour. Well, that gives us this concept that there's a break in thought, right? Because we're seeing, hey, there's a new heading. This is a separate thing. Well, that's translator bias. That's not in the Greek text. And if you were to look at how it's laid out in the manuscripts, it's one flow. There's no commas or periods. It's one running thought. And so here's how hard this is to square up. All right. If you were to look at the passage right before it, you would read, Jesus tells them from the fig tree, learn its lesson. Soon as its branches become tender, puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So he's saying in the same way that after the winter, when trees start growing leaves again, right? It's about to get hot outside. Summer's near. He's saying in the same way, when you see all this stuff that I've been telling you is coming, know that I'm near, right? You know that the parousia is close. And then he goes on and he says this, verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things. What are all these things there, Zach?
Everything he's just said before that.
Everything he's just said. He said, till all these things take place, heaven and earth will not pass away, or heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And the very next thing he says, with no page break, nothing like that, is, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, so on and so forth. Well, what day and hour is he talking about? What he's saying in the verse before? He said, heaven and earth will pass away, right? But concerning that day and hour, well, that's what he's talking about. That day is the day that old covenant structure, that heaven and earth passes away. When the parousia comes, he brings the kingdom, he judges apostate Israel, and that's it. And that's the plain reading of the text.
There's nothing in the text that indicates this switch.
No.
So they're forcing it on that day and calling it the far demonstrative. So would it be fair to say if you and I could possibly demonstrate from the Bible that the far demonstrative in other places points to 80/70, that this argument could be refuted?
Zach, I believe you may be onto something, buddy.
Okay. Maybe we'll see down the road here in just a second if we're going to be able to do that. All right, let's keep going with Gentry. He says, but after Matthew 24:34, Jesus drops all mention of signs and predictability. Okay, so 80/70 is predictable. The second coming in our future is not predictable, so he states. Instead, he includes statements emphasizing absolute surprise and total unpredictability. And I think this is such a bias by Gentry. Well, okay, here's the way you and I view it. You have all of these things that they're going to see that are signs leading up to 80/70. Once all that's fulfilled, then you don't know the day or the hour at
Mhm.
that point. Well, there's nothing in the text other than Gentry trying to use the far demonstrative, which we're going to blow up in just a minute. That is, he's trying, there's nothing in the text that's saying this has to switch to thousands of years in the future.
Yeah.
Let me continue with him.
Well, and let me speak to that because to your point, and that's not something you've just pulled out of thin air. That's literally in the text. That's in the discourse because Jesus says in verses, let's see, 12 through 14. Well, we'll just go to 14. It says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then what? And then you wait thousands of years. No, it says, and then the end will come. So Jesus is saying, after you see all this stuff, and then the last thing, so to speak, in this list is the gospel going forth to the whole world. I think the word was oikumene there. Maybe you're wrong on that. But anyway, after that, the end will come. Well, you showed really well in your video, what, 5 different Greek words where Paul was saying in late 50s, early 60s, that was done, right? The gospel had gone forth to the entire world. So what did that mean to them then if they were following Jesus' train of thought? Well, it's close, right? They may not
Right.
know the exact day or hour, but they know the end's coming because Jesus said once the gospel's gone forth, it would come.
Gentry's takes 24:14 and 80/70. Harmonize that. The end of the age in 24:3 is not 80/70, but the end in 24:14 is.
He must have been asking about a different end. I don't know.
And I don't know. Maybe they've got, I don't know. Maybe there's some apostolic insight I'm missing somewhere. Okay. Gentry continues. This indicates that the following section, after 36 and beyond, involves an event that is coming at an altogether unknown and indeterminable time. He is no longer speaking of the destruction of the temple in 80/70, but his second coming in the distant future. So instead of Jesus saying it's going to happen this generation, but you don't know the day and the hour of this generation, he's saying it, Jesus said this generation for 80/70 with predictable events. Then your future 2,000 years later, at least Parousia, has no predictability and no signs. Could happen at any time. Just to make sure everybody understands that. I hope that's clear. One more time for Gentry. Go ahead, Travis, if you want to read this one.
In the following section from Matthew 24:36 and into chapter 25, the time frame is much longer. No more do we hear of this generation. Rather, Jesus' parables anticipate a distant future.
All right. And I was thinking about how, because people always get on to us about the millennium. They're like, you guys can't make the millennium mean what you're saying it means, the time frame that you mean in the first century. So therefore, the millennium has to be a long time. And this cutting this here would seem to have to make this be a long time. And he's using the far demonstrative. So I wanted to put this John 5 passage in, and I'll let you speak to it, and then you can compare it to the discourse.
Yeah, the text reads John 5, 5, and 6. Now, a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. Circle that, folks. Highlight that. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, circle that, highlight that. He said to him, do you want to be made well? So, Zach put this in here because the Bible in John 5, it explicitly says right there that 38 years is a long time, right? And that phrase, I would butcher it in the Greek if I tried to read it to you, but this is interesting that if you go to Matthew 25, and I think we're going to get there probably next time, but in Matthew 25, Jesus gives, a couple parables, and one of them is the parable of the talents. And in the parable, there's a master that entrusts 3 of his servants with different levels of talents. It was a currency, and then he leaves. And the text says, after a long time, he returns. Okay. Well, people will use that to say, obviously, this is, that long time's thousands and thousands of years. Well, that phrase, long time, in Matthew 25 in the Greek is the exact same phrase as long time here in John 5. And if it can be 38 years in John 5, why could the master not have been gone 38 years in the parable of the talents, and then he returned, by the way, to the same servants that he left behind?
That's good. Really good point. So hopefully everybody can see where we're going with that. All right. I think that this near and far demonstrative argument fails whenever it's cross-referenced with Luke 17. So in Luke 17, 30 to 31, we read this. Even so, it will be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, he who is on the housetop and his goods are in the house, let him not come down to take them away, and likewise the one who is in the field, let him not turn back. Now let's point out something right here. Gentry, whenever he's in Matthew, he's taken everything before 35, so 4 to 35, he's taking in 80 70. Well, guess which things were said in Matthew 24, 4 to 35? Jesus told them in that generation, not he who's on your housetop, don't go and get your goods, don't go take them away. If you're in the field, don't go back. All of those things Gentry in Matthew 24 has applied to 80 70. Now, another thing we want to point out here is in that day. Now, in that day is the exact same phrase that the word for that, ekanes, Strong's Concordance number 1565, is the exact same word in Matthew 24:36 for that, when Jesus says, but of that day and hour. So far demonstrative, Gentry says, has to be at least 2,000 years now in the future. Speaking of a different day than 80 70, he contradicts himself 100% because in Luke 17:31, the exact same word, the far demonstrative, in that day is used to an event that Gentry in Matthew 24 applies to 80 70.
That's a spider web, isn't it?
Figure that one out, man.
So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, you're
Say it
saying
again. Yeah.
that in Matthew 24, if I take the language about those on their housetops, right, those in the fields, all that stuff, if I take that to 80 70, and I'm going to be consistent, then I have to take those things in Luke 17 to be 80 70. And in Luke 17, those things are correlated to that day, far demonstrative, which they're saying is thousands of years in the future in Matthew 24. So there's no consistency. Those are puzzle pieces that don't snap together. In other words, you're being really inconsistent. Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah. And like Ken Gentry's smarter than I am. He has to know that. I
Yeah.
I he's got to know this. Like somebody's had to have told him that. I don't understand that. That's such a contradiction. That's never going to work. That's not going to fit. The only thing you can do is make this whole thing in the future, which would butcher every time text in there.
At
But
least there are people out there that are consistent and do that. You know, at
yeah,
least they know better. But you and I have talked about this. It doesn't work that way. It's either all in our past or it's all in our future.
yeah.
But when you go to slicing and dicing, you're literally shredding the text apart.
That's kind of the same thing. Partial preterism is kind of doing the same thing that dispensationalists do. Dispensationalists have an issue trying to figure out which text is the rapture passage before the tribulation and which text is a second coming passage
Mm-hmm.
after the 1,000 years or after the tribulation. So that partial preterism's got the same split issues. Classic amillennialism says, no, this is one event. You and I say, yes, the classic
Yeah.
amillennial position is right. This is one event in preterist timing indicators. It's
Yep.
one event that's in our past. This is all pointing to the same thing. So,
Yeah, the
yep,
the spiritual coming that the postmillennials hold to 70 AD and the one and final coming that all millennials hold are the same coming.
right.
They're one and the same.
Yeah. So, what we're trying to do, guys, is just simply to harmonize it. And we're saying that there's
Mhm.
nothing in the language or in the text. And if you cross reference the discourses in Luke and in Matthew, you can't make the argument that Gentry's trying to make with that day in Strong's Concordance number 1565. It doesn't work. In Luke, it's applied to 80 70. And he's saying in Matthew 24:36, it has to be to a far off distant time in our future. So, he's trying to get two different comings out of this, an 80 70 and a future coming. All right. I think we've beat that enough. I think that point that we just made is probably the best point
Mhm.
that I don't know. That makes a lot of sense to me to say that's not going to work.
Well,
All
the
right.
only way again, the only way you can conclude from just the plain reading in the text that this is he's suddenly pivoted to looking thousands of years, into the future. The only way you get there is if you bring that to the text. Like if you were to hand this book to somebody that's never studied eschatology and be like, what do you get out of that? How are you going to read that and think, well, he's been talking to these guys about all the stuff they would see in their generation, and then now all of a sudden he's just shifted and it has no relevance to them whatsoever anymore.
Yeah.
That's absurd. Nobody would come away with that unless we carried that into the text. We presupposed it ahead of time and then tried to build a foundation, or build our structure rather, on that foundation that we brought to the text. You don't get that from exegesis.
I think one of the biggest issues that speaks exactly to what you just said is that none of these partial preterist guys agree. They cannot agree on where to split the discourse.
Yep.
So you take Philip Kaiser splitting it here at 36, Gentry splitting it here at 36. Well, Durbin doesn't split it until you get to 25, and Doug Wilson doesn't split it on later into 25. I've heard him say before. So you've just got passages that are cut up all over the place, and there's no consistency because half of them are saying the same things we are, and you just can't do this there, and it doesn't work.
Yep.
So when they write the letter to Gary tomorrow or something like that, this is why there's so much frustration from our side, because we're saying, look, you guys are trying to pin us on something. You can't even agree on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they're like, and Gary's like, what are your texts? And they're like, here's our text. And then, these two agree that one's 70, but this one doesn't. And it's insane. It's absolutely insane. You're going to condemn this guy for something you can't agree on.
Ken Gentry, 2 Peter 3 is in the future. Doug Wilson and Jeff Durbin, no, it's in the past. I mean, just all kinds of, that's a pretty big deal. I mean,
very big
deal. That's not like a, just some little text from nowhere. Anyway, and what you do, the discourse impacts all of that as well. Let's look at Gentry on Parousia. He says, this is significant in that the disciples' original question regarding his coming uses the word parousia, Matthew 24:3, when what will be the sign of your coming, parousia, yet Jesus studiously avoids the term to describe events occurring in the first century. So again, Gentry says that question, the sign of your coming, is not about 80-70. He says it's about the future. Go back and watch our first video for the 5th time now that I've referenced that. He continues. In Matthew 24, 4-34, he never uses the word parousia, except in verse 27, where he intentionally distinguishes his visible second advent from the first century. Deceptions which claim Jesus is hidden here or there. So when they say he's here or there, don't believe it, yada, yada, yada. Then it says in the text in 24:27, it reads, for as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming, parousia, of the Son of Man be.
You see what Gentry does there? He's saying Jesus never talks about his parousia until after verse 34. Well, except this one time, but he's not really talking about his parousia right there. That again, there's that assumption, there's that presupposition. If you're going to say that, you have to prove that. And you can't prove that because that's just flat out made up.
The way I take this, correct me if I'm wrong, he's saying they're mistakenly identifying the parousia at the 80-70 coming, but this is really something that's in the future?
Right. Yeah, I guess. I don't know what he's saying.
What? I don't.
But again, okay, if we're going to be consistent and tie this in with Luke 17 again, this exact same language is in Luke 17. And if Luke 17, the lightning coming from the east, if this is 80-70, how is it not 80-70 here in Matthew 24:27?
Yeah,
and if it is 80-70, and it is, then Gentry has a problem because Jesus is answering a question about his parousia prior to verse 34.
Yeah, man, this is like cutting and pasting what you want. I don't know what hermeneutical principle you can get to come up with this.
Well, you take a 52 card deck and then you start stacking. And I think that's pretty much it because it is a house of cards, what these guys are teaching.
I don't see any possible way to do what he's trying to do here.
And, I don't know if you wanted to get into this or not, but, our friend Mike Sullivan in his book, Armageddon Deception, the Trump book, what we call it. In the Trump book, he has a whole section on Luke 17, and he talks about that Greek word. I think it's astrape. Yeah, there he is. Look, the dawn. I think it's the word astrape, and it can literally mean bright light. And so Sullivan takes the position that Jesus is saying it's like the bright light that comes from the east and flashes to the west. that's how his coming will be. Well, what is a bright light that rises from the east and shines all the way to the west? Well, it's the sun, right? It's the sun. And if you tie that in with prophetic texts like I think Malachi 3 and 4, Paul talked about how the day was at hand in the book of Romans. That was a contrast of ages because they were living in an age that they categorized as the age of darkness, but they were looking for the messianic age, which was the age of light. And so what Sullivan is saying then is that's exactly what he's saying here, is that at his parousia, when that new covenant messianic kingdom comes in, it's going to be like that eternal sun, that eternal light that they're all looking for. And then, Zach, you get to Revelation 21, and what do you see about the new city, the new Jerusalem?
There's no
There
night
is,
there.
do what?
There's no night there.
There's no night because it says the Lamb is the lamp. He is their light, and that is the point of that text.
The day star has risen in their heart. All right, that's good. Let's keep going. Okay, let's look at pre-mill commentator John Gill, and let's see what he says about this text in Matthew 24:36. He says, "The coming of the Son of Man to take vengeance on the Jews, and of their destruction, for the words manifestly regard the date of several things going before." He connects 24:36 to all the previous events, and he's premill, which only can be applied to that catastrophe and dreadful desolation. Now, though the destruction itself was spoken of by Moses and the prophets, was foretold by Christ, and the believing Jews had some discerning of its near approach, see Hebrews 10:25, yet the exact precise time was unknown. Is that not amazing? That John Gill, premillennial, would take Matthew 24:36 and apply it to 80-70 with the rest of it, as well as Hebrews 10:25.
Yep.
Like, I just read that and think, how they not harmonize some of this a little bit more? Like, I don't know. I don't
How
get
does
it.
John Gill not follow that to its logical conclusion?
Because they had a different mindset about the book of Revelation. You
Yeah.
don't connect it to the rest of the scripture. Like, that's all you can do with that. But they saw this stuff everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I got another one. You want to read Adam Clarke's?
Clarke says, as the day was not known in which Jerusalem should be invested by the Romans, therefore our Lord advised his disciples to pray that it might not be on a Sabbath. As the season was not known, therefore they were to pray that it might not be in winter. Matthew 24:20.
The reason I put this stuff in here was just so some of you guys could see, like, these commentators are taking 36 and connecting it to everything before it and applying it to 80-70.
Mm-hmm.
So there are guys who are doing that.
Well,
Now
I
let's
got a sidebar to that real quick.
go ahead.
Something else that you and I will hear a lot is dealing with the law, like the old covenant law, and when the law died, when the law passed away. And a lot of these guys that oppose some of the stuff we're talking about, they'll say that the law was done, it was null and void at the cross, right? Well, if that's the case, and Jesus is talking about events between the cross and leading up to AD 70, why would it matter to them whether or not their flight was on a Sabbath? Well, because what he's appealing to is that Sabbath day journey. They were only allowed to travel so far. And so when you start messing with it, it doesn't work. If the law was done away with in 80, 30, 33, whatever view you want to take, that verse makes no sense at all. But if there were still certain things that were binding to those Jewish people, Jewish believers, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, that's an issue. All right, so let's talk about, okay, what about not knowing the day and the hour? So let's talk about the birth pang analogy. Let me read 36 again in Matthew 24. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So you and I are saying, Jesus said, this generation in a 40-year span, but no one knows the day or the hour.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all over the place. This is connected to a birth pang analogy. It'd be like a woman in birth. Well, if a woman carries full term, she carries for 40 weeks. The pain is worse at the end, the Great Tribulation, and you know the about time when the baby's going to come.
Right.
Jesus said this generation 40 years, but not the exact day when the baby's coming. That's why this fits so perfectly. If you rip that out of that 40-year period, then the whole analogy falls apart.
Yep. That's right. And my wife is a labor and delivery nurse, and she can tell you very clearly, even when a doctor schedules an induction, you still can't pin it down, maybe the day, but you still can't pin it down to the hour. There's this unknown element to childbirth, and that's the exact point in the analogy, like you're talking about. That's Jesus' point.
This
Is
is
you
why.
don't you I can give you a roundabout, it's going to happen within this time frame, but you don't know specifically when. And then that's why at the end of 24 and into 25, he's given they're kind of cyclical, his parables, and they have 2 points: be ready and be faithful. And now why would he be telling his first century disciples be ready and be faithful, and absolutely beating that nail to death if it didn't have anything to do with them?
Yeah, and Ken Gentry is someone who hammers audience relevance just like the rest of us do.
Hmm.
So all we're asking for is a little consistency. And you know, I don't know who's watching this and who isn't watching this, but me and Travis get hammered all the time over stuff. So especially if you're, somebody that knows us and is local, like we see this stuff in the text. I mean, it's not that, well, we just want to put it there. No, there's only one way
Right.
any of this makes sense. Like we can't do anything else with that. So you got to be consistent. And there's only one way to be consistent, and that's to apply this all to the same coming. Now, whether you want to put it all in the future or not, we don't think can be done, but this
Yep.
is the same thing. There's no splitting this.
And the only way that you don't get our view is if you are not allowed to, right? And I think that's a lot of people's problem is we're told you can't believe full preterism, right? That's off the table. And so if
Yeah.
that's not even a choice, if I can't even entertain that, what do we do with this text? And that's why you start splitting things. And these guys, you touched on this with Gentry, but all these guys are smarter than we are. Okay. And they all know that if I'm going to be consistent and take this at 70 and that, well, that road leads you to one destination. But
Yeah.
if they have it in their heads, I can't go there, then I have to formulate some kind of doctrine to do something with this. And that's why it's what they do. And that's why it looks like shooting a shotgun and there's just pellets all over the place, because all of them are on a different page, but they're trying to do something with it, trying to harmonize the things that they can't harmonize. Whereas we're over here like, hey, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I think GK Bill's done a lot of good work in and he's all millennial, just
Mhm.
showing that all of it's one coming, even with his like his charts and cross referencing Thessalonians and Matthew, like we did the last time, and just some of that work. I don't know. Just keep studying, guys. All right, one final slide, and we'll wrap this thing up. This is the order. So Luke changes the order of the discourse from what Matthew did. Now you got to think these things. Everything on under the Matthew slide, the first three, Gentry is placing that in 80/70. Well, if you'll look over to the right side where the days of Noah are, well, you've got the don't turn back in the city, and where the body is, the eagles will be gathered after the days of Noah, which in Matthew, Gentry says after the days of Noah is in our future. But over in Luke, you've got things that supposedly in Matthew happened before that are happening in 80/70. So you're
And,
getting,
and mind you, Luke 17, too, I don't think we mentioned this, is set in the context of the Pharisees asking about the kingdom. They're asking Jesus about when his kingdom's going to come. And what is the context of Matthew 24:3? What are they asking about? It's his parousia, or his arriving, his coming into his kingdom, which marks the end of the old covenant age. So there is perfect harmony between Luke 17 and Luke 24. And I point that out lest we be tempted to think, well, these are just two totally different things. No, they're not. They're the same thing. And if you're going to be consistent and any of that is Luke, or any of that is AD 70, then why is all of it not?
it's good, really good. All right, let's make a point on this. We didn't even talk about discussing this, but I think it's worth mentioning. These days of Noah. So when Gentry places this in the future, you're going to have to put First Thessalonians 4 in the future, okay? Because you've still got to have this physical rapture at the end of his human history, okay? So if that's the case, in his days of Noah, in our future, then you're going to have the righteous taken off the earth, and whatever way. I don't care what he does with that, whether they meet him in the air and usher him back in, like
Mhm.
R.C. Sproul talks about, whatever that is, it voids the context here of what happens in this passage. You think about somebody like Philip Kaiser, who takes First Thessalonians 4 in 80/70 and takes this passage right here to be in mind in your future. Well, where's he getting? Where's he getting this rapture concept at? He's already given the other passage back to 80/70. It doesn't. Oh, holy smokes! I I can't even fathom that. Travis, what about days of Noah? Who was left? Who was taken?
Well, in the days of Noah, I think that it was the Noah and his family that were spared, right? And all the wicked people that were taken, they were washed away. And that's his point here too. But see, I think the main reason he puts this in here, and maybe you weren't going to go there with it, but I think it's Daniel 9, because he's talking about the 70 weeks, right? When this thing's going to end, and he says that it would end with a flood.
Good point.
And he talks about the city and the sanctuary being destroyed, and that's all in the same section. And I think that's why Jesus is tying this in here, because what did the days of Noah end with? A flood, right?
Yep.
And that's the point. It's going to be another judgment. But when you tie that in with Daniel 7, again, the city, Jerusalem, and the sanctuary, meaning the temple, were going to go down. That would seal up Daniel's 70 weeks, which is, if you've watched our other 3 videos, we've beat that horse to death, I think. But that's the point. All this stuff works together. None of it is, despite what we may think, none of it is detached.
The meek shall inherit the earth, or
Yep.
the land. And they did. All right, here's another thought just to end on, just to leave everybody's mind thinking. I don't know where I'm at on flood, global or local, but just imagine if it is a local flood with a covenantal context, how strong that argument is to this. Because you're turning, everybody's looking at this text. Gentry's trying to make this be some kind of global day of judgment and destruction. Imagine if that flood is local and covenantal. Just food for thought. But I know me and you neither one are decided on that.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one day in 17 years we'll do a video on it. So,
well, and to kind of chase the rabbit a little bit that you just touched on, back to the whole the gospel going forth to the whole oikumene, and Paul was saying that was done. That would be that local context you're talking about. And also in Revelation 21, whenever the New Jerusalem comes down, I can't remember the exact measurement. I should have looked this up, but it's literally the size of the Roman Empire, right?
yeah.
And it's the same picture. All this stuff again, it's very consistent, I would say.
Well, thanks for watching, everybody. Appreciate your support for the channel. Like and subscribe down below. Support on patreon.com/Zach Davis. Leave in the comments. Tell how Travis should let me post his discourse series and that he should be on the channel more. Hopefully, I think the biggest thing we talked about today maybe is probably what the use of the far demonstrative and how it's applied to 80-70 in Luke. So that pretty much ruins that argument. And I hope you'll continue to support. God bless you. Travis, thanks for being on again, buddy.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll see y'all soon.